Jeff, our final section, the whole show has been about kind of looking back in history for lessons that can be applied to the present because we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over. And the good news, I guess, for the rest of the world is that Japan went first. There's a lot of talk right now about stimulus, about the fiscal arm joining the monetary arm and pushing forward and implementing new policies, and that there's going to be some sort of recovery because there's going to be a massive spending bill coming perhaps after the election. And we can look to Japan in 2012, 2013, when QQE was being introduced. So can you set the stage
everything
for
that
us?
you just said, right, Emil, is well, there's a word for it. It's called Abenomics. You know, Shinzo Abe, who became prime minister in late 2012, introduced this concept, which was, by the way, consulting with Paul Krugman and his central thesis, which is, again, credibly promised to be irresponsible. The Bank of Japan has done it. If the U.S. Federal Reserve and the U.S. government is following an economic plan, you can bet dollars to donuts that the Japanese have already done it. And usually, and this is the weird, eerie thing, all you have to do is go back 7 years. So if you go back 7 years, you'll probably see the Japanese did the same thing that we're about to take place. That happened. QE1 was in 2001 in Japan, and QE1 in the United States, guess what? 7 years later in 2008. So here we have a combination in 2020. The Fed is going to raise its inflation target. That's what average inflation target is. What they're saying is that the short-run inflation target for the Fed is no longer a target. They're just going to let it go hot. So they've raised their inflation target. At the same time, they're doing massive money printing in this massive, irresponsible QE, which, again, is exactly what happened in early 2013. Again, that time period, early 2013, in Japan. Japan announced in January of 2013 they were going to raise their explicit inflation target to 2%. They were that confident in themselves. They had a 1% target. We're going to make it 2% because we believe this. And then in April 2013 was the big one, the QQE, the massive money printing, the beyond any kind of irresponsibility.
And that was because, and if you want to join us, you can read this article. It's October 14th, posted at Humber Investments. And the title that you want to look for is "You Need to Understand What's Really Behind This New V." And once again, Japan is more than helpful. Jeff, so they proposed this solution called QQE because the problem isn't the central bank's competence, right? The problem is they're omnipotent. That's what the public believes, that they'll step in. They're always in control, and they'll step in and fix any inflation. So they wanted to show everybody QQE. We promise we're going to go nuts. We're going to spend everything. It was all over the news, even here in the United States. I was reading it in The Economist, Abenomics, the three arrows. It was a big deal. Everybody knew that the government was going to spend more money than anyone had ever imagined before. And for a long time, this was a long-term project. You provide some statistics. How many times did inflation breach their target in the 91 months after what was it? QQE started 88 months in. So what was it that started 91 months? The inflation
target. Yeah, the 2% target. Since they raised their 2% target in January of 2012, so February 2012 forward, they reached that 2% target on the CPI, the headline CPI, exactly once. And not counting the VAT tax effect. There was some inflation in 2014 that was attributable to the tax hike. But if you back that out, the underlying CPI just reached 2%, not stayed above 2%, which is what a target's supposed to be around 2%, just reached it in 1 month out of 91.
Jeff, I'm not a baseball fan, but even I know that if you're below 50%, you can still be successful in baseball at hitting. Is 1 out of 91, does that qualify as a success in monetary policy, in your professional opinion?
So, right, because I mean, we're not supposed to hit the target once. We're supposed to hit it. It's supposed to be a target month after month, sustained levels. And the funny thing is, if you look at Japanese inflation, they would have had trouble even reaching the 1% target in most months, the vast majority of the time. I didn't go back and count the number of months they'd reached it, but they were so few they would have even failed at their 1% target. And so what did QQE plus raising the inflation target actually accomplish? I mean, it accomplished what it was supposed to in technical terms, which was not money printing, by the way. The technical toolkit is, as you pointed out already, Emil, it got the financial media globally to write all of these stories about how this was massive money, ultra, all the words that the financial press always uses. That happened. But what we see yet again, is that, so what? Trying to influencing people's expectations may not be the secret to economic success after all. Maybe we need to go past this idea of, hey, random good luck or old-fashioned good luck and start doing some good old-fashioned monetary stuff. And that's kind of where we're getting with this QE thing, and I think it's been going long enough. When you look back at Japan in particular, what you see is nothing but one failure after another. And I think a lot of people are starting to get the sense that this QE stuff really is nonsense.
And is that what the Federal Reserve concluded at the beginning of this year? I'm going to pull up a quote for everyone. It's too long for me to read, but it's so important that I want our YouTube audience to be reading this as you're talking. Jeff, what is this quote about, and what does it have to do with Japan's experience?
Well, let me point out first, it's not just this one quote. We're not just cherry picking here. We're not just saying, hey, the Federal Reserve said this one time. This is, if you actually read most of the academic literature about QE, going back to the early 2000s of Japanese experience, what they'll say is, yeah, this stuff doesn't really work. At least at the most charitable, they'll say it doesn't work the way we think it works. In fact, we don't really know how it works. We just kind of hope that it does. And the quote we're showing you here was from January of this year, January of 2020. This was written by the Federal Reserve in January 2020, saying that these large-scale asset purchases in Japan, while there's a high degree of uncertainty regarding their effectiveness. Think about what that means, a high degree of uncertainty after 2 decades of quantitative easing. And when you put that together with its actual track record and even its academic track record, the term high degree of uncertainty, what that actually means is, hey, this stuff doesn't work, and it hasn't in the past, but just maybe it could work in the future. That's what high degree of uncertainty says. That's the most charitable way the Federal Reserve in January of this year could put these QE and asset purchases. Hey, it hasn't worked so far, but maybe it could. That's really what we're supposed to be basing this idea that everything's going to be good and inflationary next year. We're supposed to be basing it on high degree of uncertainty. And again, that's the most charitable case. We look at any number of other academic studies and articles, it gets even worse, as the central bankers themselves have to admit.
This is a sensational pair of paragraphs here. And my favorite part, you haven't even bolded, and it has to do with the inflation targeting. Here's my favorite part. It's in the second paragraph, the very first sentence there. It's thus, in thinking about whether to raise the inflation target to a certain level, central banks need to take into account whether they are able to raise inflation to a new target level.
That's the funny thing is that is a really important sentence, as you pointed out, Emil. But what they're actually saying there, because remember, this is a Federal Reserve. You look back at the Japanese QE experience. What they're saying in reality is, we believe the Fed can raise the inflation target. We don't believe the Japanese can, even though we use exactly the same tools and we do the same things. Usually 7 years. We don't think the Japanese can do it, but we can do it fine. They don't take their own words for it. I mean, high degree of uncertainty. I mean, it just boggles the mind. And of course, the public, politicians even, nobody knows this stuff. It's not like this is common knowledge. But if you go back through, don't take my word for it, go back through all the literature, and what you'll see is central bankers trying really, really hard to move the goalpost to just make it seem like this QE stuff even works a little bit. And really, the best they can come up with, high degree of uncertainty.
And the thing is, it's this inflation targeting isn't the first monetary tool that they have seen Japan struggle with, and then they themselves have struggled with, right? To your point. So QE first in Japan, they said, well, it would work if we did it. They did it, it didn't work. And now here we are again. Yeah, inflation targeting, if they knew what they were doing, it would work, but they don't. So, but we'll take care of it.
Yeah, a couple months later, they're right back in the Japanese doing it all over again, right? I mean, it's the combination of inflation target plus massive QE. That's what Japan did in 2013. And take a look at what the Japanese said about their own assessment of their effectiveness.
Jeff, later in the article, you talked about how the economy grew, how real private consumption grew, real domestic growth grew during QE and QQE. Can you summarize that for us? And with the expectation is that that's likely what's going to happen in Europe and the United States and wherever else a QQE is attempted.
The sum is that it doesn't work. But no, QQE itself has underperformed even the prior QEs. When you look at both private consumption as well as GDP, it's been atrociously. I mean, not even close. Even when I did the put together those numbers, I didn't even include the recessions in them, just to present to you the most charitable argument in favor of these things. And even on the upswings, even on the economic upturns, the Japanese economy barely manages 2% growth. And then since QQE, it's not even that. It's not even half of that. And it's okay. So even on its own terms, QQE didn't even improve on QE, which didn't work. So
I'm going to quote you as a way to conclude this article, but let me know if there are any other thoughts that you want to share with the audience. Quote, in short, there is absolutely nothing legitimate upon which to base the Fed's late 2020 more optimistic inflationary forecasts. Nothing. It's all smoke and mirrors, a tired puppet show increasingly lacking the slightest originality. The entire monetary toolkit consists of uncritical stories written up in Bloomberg and for CNBC. That's all it ever was.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is I want to point out that in that article I included a Bank of Japan study from 2017 that looked at a QQE relatively closer to that time period. And again, this is a Bank of Japan study, and what they conclude is, in terms of inflation, it didn't do anything. In fact, their specific time period to look at was 2015, the fiscal year 2015. And they said when QQE was in QQE plus inflation target, this Abenomics stuff was first unveiled in 2013, that they expected about 2% inflation in 2015, 1.9%. Just to be charitable, they gave it 1.9%. And inflation in 2015 was 0. So they missed it by 100%.
Just a bit outside.
And this is 2 years later. They gave it enough time to ramp itself up. And 2 years later, regardless of the economic statistics, on judging it by inflation alone, it missed it entirely. And it didn't get any better ever since 2017. Inflation rose a little bit in 2017 and 2018, consistent with what we call inflation number 3 around here. And of course, as soon as Eurodollar number 4 showed up in 2018, guess what happened to Japanese inflation? The same thing that always happens. And that's really the point to wrap this thing up, going back to our first segment. For central bankers, this massive global monetary system doesn't factor. They don't care about the Eurodollar system, even though in 1988, it was already a third or more bigger than the domestic monetary system. And that is just including the traditional deficit. We haven't even got to derivatives and some of the more fuzzy stuff that caused Morgan Guarantee to stop measuring the Eurodollar system. We don't even factor that stuff. So we have this massive monetary system that no central bank actually factors. And they keep doing these QE without factoring those massive monetary factors. And guess what they keep finding? That it's either good luck or bad luck. And since this monetary system broke down in August 2007, central banks all around the world, despite bigger QEs and inflation targets, have had a run of bad luck. And that's what we're supposed to believe is changing. Sorry, no wonder markets aren't buying it.
No, I'm responsible. I'm reminded of the fact that that study you mentioned by Japan is at least the second one that I know of, because they also wrote one about QE, and they said it didn't work. And now they're writing about QQE and inflation targeting and how that didn't work, which reminds me then of your quote here of the lacking of originality, because now we're hearing word out of Europe that the European Central Bank is considering doing a whole review, which will likely lead to some of the exact same policies that the Fed has implemented that Japan has already shown that it's not working. And I think the Bank of England is preparing to do negative interest rates as well. Jeff, has the Bank of Japan come out with a study on negative interest rate policy and how it hasn't worked?
Yes. I mean, there's several. If there's a monetary policy that the Japanese pioneered, there's several studies. And it's funny because you pointed, the study I think you're thinking of was from 2006, maybe 2005. The first QE,
that's
and what they said is they examined all the theoretical channels and said, okay, portfolio rebalancing, that didn't work. Signaling, that didn't work either. Low interest rates, well, maybe that worked, but as we know, low interest rates are not the function of monetary policy. They're the function of the bond market saying, you guys are a bunch of morons. You have no idea what you're doing. And as you're pointing out, this stuff it's proliferating everywhere. We're following Japan. Yeah, the Europeans just announced, hey, we're going to undertake a grand strategy review. Why? Because it works so well in the U.S.? No, they have no idea what else to do because to them, this is all just bad luck. When in fact, there's this massive monetary system out here. Massive. It's been, you just look backwards and it was massive 40 years ago. And it just doesn't factor in anything these people do. Yet we're supposed to take their word for some of these very big things that are going on. Inflation means growth, recovery, the economy getting out of its huge hole, these kinds of things, even though we haven't recovered from the last one yet. But we're supposed to believe QE and inflation targets are the answer.
Great stuff, Jeff. I think we ran long on today's show, but I know the audience is going to enjoy it. So I want to wish you a good weekend, and I'll talk to you again next weekend.
All right, Emil, take care. You didn't leave me speechless this time.
I want to tell the audience, I have not been drinking before the show, although I'm going to. I'm stumbling all over my words. So I'll talk to you next week, Jeff.
Okay, Emil, take care.